What if your biggest achievement was built on your worst betrayal? District Attorney James Calloway sent an innocent man to prison to win an election. 3 years later, the truth is eating him alive. As Matthew Sullivan sits behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, James must decide: continue living the lie or risk losing everything to make it right. When justice comes too late for apologies, what price must be paid for redemption? A powerful story about the choices that define us and the courage it takes to face them. Have you ever made a mistake so grave that no apology could ever make it right? We all lie sometimes, small, harmless deceptions that fade from memory. But what happens when a lie destroys someone's life? In the quiet town of Riverdale, Connecticut, District Attorney James Calloway built his reputation on winning cases and putting criminals behind bars. His ambition was undeniable, his dedication admirable. At 42, he was already being whispered about as a future governor, but James carried a secret that would eventually crack the foundation of his carefully constructed life, a secret that began with a desperate choice one rainy October night. When Matthew Sullivan was convicted of armed robbery and attempted murder, the town celebrated. Another criminal off the streets, another victory for justice. The evidence seemed airtight: an eyewitness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and James Calloway's masterful prosecution. No one questioned the verdict, least of all James himself. But what happens when the man who upholds justice becomes the one who perverts it? This isn't just a story about a wrongful conviction. It's about how one moment of weakness, one choice made in fear and self-preservation, can unravel lives like loose thread on an old sweater. Stay with me until the end, because this story's final lesson is one we all need to hear, about truth, redemption, and the price we pay when justice comes too late. James Calloway grew up believing in black and white, right and wrong. The son of a small-town judge, he saw the world through the lens of justice. Those who follow the rules prosper. Those who break them pay. By his early 40s, James had become Riverdale's youngest district attorney, with a reputation for being tough but fair. His office walls displayed framed newspaper articles detailing his most significant victories. Calloway secures justice for murder victims' family. DA's innovative approach leads to record conviction. What those walls didn't show were the cracks forming in his personal life. A marriage strained by his 70-hour work weeks, 2 teenage children who barely knew him beyond his public persona. Behind James's confident exterior lurked insecurities that few ever saw. He measured his worth through wins and losses, through the approval of others. Each case became not just about justice, but about validation. His colleagues noticed his increasing obsession with conviction rates, his growing irritation when evidence seemed insufficient. Sometimes the system has to work harder to get the right result, he'd say during late office hours. His administrative assistant, Carol, would later recall how he began cutting corners, rushing investigations, pressuring witnesses. His boss, the aging county prosecutor William Hayes, had warned him, "Don't let ambition cloud your judgment, James. We serve truth first, careers second." The pressure was building as election season approached. James had his eye on the county prosecutor position, with Hayes announcing his retirement. But a recent string of high-profile cases had gone cold, or ended in acquittals. The media questioned whether James was losing his touch. At home, his wife Sarah suggested therapy for his increasing anxiety and insomnia. "There's more to life than winning cases, James," she'd say, but he couldn't see it. In his mind, failure wasn't an option. Each acquittal felt like a personal betrayal of the victims, and of his father's legacy. The judge's words echoed in his mind. A Calloway stands for justice, no matter the cost. James's relationship with police officers had always been complicated. He demanded perfection from them, often publicly criticizing their work when cases fell apart. Detective Michael Brennan particularly resented James's holier-than-thou attitude. "You get to play the hero in court," Brennan once said, "while we do the dirty work on the streets." This tension would prove fateful in the Sullivan case. When Brennan brought James a case with holes in it, James didn't push back as he normally would. Instead, he saw an opportunity to score a quick win, to add another headline to his wall. The fact that the evidence against Matthew Sullivan seemed circumstantial at best didn't concern him as much as it should have. Few people knew about James's most shameful secret, an incident from law school where he'd cheated on a crucial exam. He'd justified it then as a one-time necessity, a moment of weakness during a personal crisis. No one had ever discovered it, but the memory haunted him, fueling his need to appear perfect, incorruptible. This same pattern of self-deception, of convincing himself that small ethical compromises served a greater good, would become his undoing. As he prepared for the Sullivan case, James ignored the doubts nagging at the edges of his consciousness. The convenience store robbery had been high profile. The owner, shot but surviving, was a beloved community figure. Someone needed to pay, and Matthew Sullivan, with his prior record for petty theft, seemed to fit the bill. The Sullivan case landed on James's desk 3 months before the election. A convenience store robbery gone wrong. The owner, Mr. Wilson, shot in the shoulder but alive to identify his attacker. The police had arrested Matthew Sullivan, a 32-year-old carpenter with a decade-old conviction for shoplifting. The evidence was far from conclusive. Grainy security footage showing someone of Sullivan's build, a partial fingerprint that could have belonged to dozens of people who visited the store that day, and a witness who claimed to have seen Sullivan running from the scene. Detective Brennan seemed convinced of Sullivan's guilt, but something about the case didn't add up. Mr. Wilson's description of the shooter had been vague at best. Average height, dark hoodie, baseball cap pulled low. The real turning point came when James interviewed Mr. Wilson in the hospital. The elderly man seemed confused, his memory affected by trauma and medication. "I think it was him," Wilson said when shown Sullivan's photo, but his voice wavered. James should have noted this uncertainty, should have questioned whether this identification was reliable. Instead, he heard himself saying, "Take your time, Mr. Wilson. Is this the man who shot you?" The leading question hung in the air. When Wilson nodded, James felt relief wash over him. Later, he would justify editing his notes to make Wilson's identification seem more definitive. A small adjustment, he told himself. Not a lie, just a clarification of what Wilson truly meant. The trial was scheduled for just 2 weeks before the election. Perfect timing for James to demonstrate his effectiveness to voters. As he built his case, he received an anonymous envelope at his office. Inside were photos from a security camera across the street from the convenience store, showing someone who looked like Sullivan at a bar 3 miles away, time-stamped during the robbery. James sat at his desk for hours staring at those photos. They didn't definitively prove Sullivan's innocence. The timestamp could be wrong. The person could be someone else. But they created reasonable doubt. Instead of sharing this evidence with the defense as required by law, James locked the envelope in his desk drawer. "I'll look into this more thoroughly after the arraignment," he told himself, knowing the lie even as he formed it. In court, James was at his most persuasive. He painted Sullivan as a desperate man with a history of theft who had escalated to violence. He coached Mr. Wilson carefully before his testimony, subtly reinforcing his wavering identification. When Sullivan's public defender, an overworked young lawyer named Diane Martinez, questioned the lack of definitive evidence, James redirected the jury's attention to Mr. Wilson's emotional testimony. "Look at this brave man," he told the jury during closing arguments. "Look into his eyes and tell him he doesn't know who shot him." It was emotionally manipulative, and James knew it, but he could feel the jury responding, could see in their eyes that they believed him. When Sullivan was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years, James allowed himself a moment of triumph. Election night arrived, and James celebrated his victory as the new county prosecutor. Champagne flowed as supporters congratulated him on both his electoral success and the Sullivan conviction. In a quiet moment, Detective Brennan approached him. "You know, there were problems with that case," Brennan said quietly, "but you made it work." The comment wasn't meant as criticism. Rather, it was Brennan acknowledging a kindred spirit in moral flexibility. James should have been disturbed by this, but instead he felt a strange brotherhood with the detective. That night, as he drove home, slightly drunk on champagne and success, James passed the convenience store where it all happened. For a brief moment, he thought about the envelope in his desk drawer, about Matthew Sullivan beginning his first month behind bars. Then he pushed the thought away. Some sacrifices had to be made for the greater good, he told himself. One criminal off the streets meant countless potential victims protected. 6 months into his new role as county prosecutor, James had nearly succeeded in burying his doubts about the Sullivan case. When intrusive thoughts about the hidden evidence surfaced, he'd remind himself of Sullivan's prior record, of the statistical likelihood that he was guilty of something, even if not this particular crime. He threw himself into work, taking on high-profile cases personally, rather than delegating them to his staff. Sarah noticed his increasing absences from home, the dark circles under his eyes. "You won already, James. Why are you still campaigning?" she asked one night. But it wasn't about the job anymore. It was about outrunning his conscience, staying too busy to think about what he'd done. The first real crack in his denial came when he ran into Sullivan's daughter at a coffee shop. 19-year-old Emily Sullivan was working behind the counter, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. James recognized her from the trial. She'd sat behind her father every day, clutching her grandmother's hand. When she called out his name for his order, their eyes met, and James saw recognition flicker across her face. No hatred, just a profound sadness that made his chest tighten. He left his coffee untouched and fled the shop. That night, he pulled out the case file, reread every document, searching for reassurance that he'd done the right thing. Instead, the doubts only grew stronger. James began checking up on Sullivan in prison, requesting reports on his behavior, his health. He told himself it was simple due diligence, but deep down, he knew he was looking for evidence that Sullivan deserved to be there. The reports showed a model prisoner who maintained his innocence, who had joined a carpentry program and was teaching other inmates. Each positive note twisted the knife of guilt deeper. James began having nightmares, dreams where he was the one behind bars, with Sullivan as his judge. He started drinking more heavily, a glass of whiskey when he got home, another before bed. Sarah found empty bottles hidden in his home office. "Whatever's eating at you," she said. "Alcohol won't fix it." But talking about it wasn't an option. How could he admit what he'd done? When Diane Martinez, Sullivan's former public defender, joined the county prosecutor's office, James panicked. He'd approved her hiring without making the connection, a testament to how overworked and distracted he'd become. Now she was part of his team, bringing her sharp mind and ethical rigor to his doorstep. During her first month, she requested to review some of his past cases as learning examples. James deflected, directing her toward other prosecutors' work. When she specifically asked about the Sullivan case, mentioning that something had never sat right with her about it, James snapped at her unprofessionally. The outburst was noticed by others in the office. That night, he apologized via email, blaming stress, but the damage was done. Martinez began looking more closely at the Sullivan conviction. A year after the conviction, James received a letter from Sullivan himself. He left it unopened on his desk for days, both dreading and curious about its contents. When he finally read it, Sullivan's words were not what he expected. No accusations, no anger, just a simple request. "My daughter is struggling to pay for college while supporting my mother. If you believe in justice, please make sure she gets the victim compensation funds she's entitled to as a family member of an incarcerated person." The letter mentioned nothing about innocence or evidence, but its dignified tone crushed James more than any accusation could have. That night, he anonymously arranged for a private scholarship for Emily Sullivan through a foundation he had connections with. It was the first tangible acknowledgement to himself that he had wronged this family, though still not one he was ready to make publicly. 2 years into Sullivan's sentence, the cracks in James's life began to widen into chasms. Sarah moved into the guest bedroom, tired of his emotional distance and late-night drinking. "I don't know who you are anymore," she said one morning, "and I don't think you do either." His oldest son, Nathan, now in college, stopped calling home. When James questioned him about it during a rare visit, Nathan shrugged. "You taught me actions have consequences, Dad." Well, absence has consequences too. At work, James developed a reputation for micromanaging cases, questioning evidence obsessively, demanding multiple verifications for witness statements. His staff attributed it to perfectionism. Only James knew it was fear of making another Sullivan-sized mistake, or perhaps fear of having his first one discovered. The physical toll became impossible to ignore. James developed high blood pressure, insomnia that medication couldn't touch. During an important trial, he suffered a panic attack in the courthouse bathroom, heart racing, unable to breathe, convinced he was dying. A junior prosecutor found him and called an ambulance. The media reported it as exhaustion and dehydration, but doctors warned James that his body was sounding alarms he couldn't keep ignoring. He was prescribed anti-anxiety medication but often forgot to take it, unconsciously believing he deserved the suffering. The panic attacks continued, unpredictable and debilitating. Each time one struck, the image of Matthew Sullivan behind bars flashed through his mind. James's professional reputation began to suffer. His newfound caution in pursuing cases, his insistence on irrefutable evidence before charging suspects, frustrated law enforcement. Detective Brennan, now a captain, confronted him after a particularly difficult case was dropped. "You've gone soft," Brennan accused. The James Calloway who put Sullivan away wouldn't hesitate to move on this. The comment was meant to sting, but it had the opposite effect. It horrified James to think that his greatest professional achievement was built on his greatest moral failure. At a department meeting the following week, Brennan publicly questioned whether James still had the stomach for the job. The room fell silent, waiting for the fierce rebuttal that the old James would have delivered. Instead, James simply ended the meeting. The most painful consequence came through his daughter, Lily, now 17 and starting to consider law schools. "I want to be just like you, Dad," she told him over dinner one night, her eyes shining with admiration that felt like acid on his skin. Fighting for justice, making sure the right people pay for their crimes. James excused himself from the table and vomited in the bathroom. The thought of his daughter following in his footsteps, not the idealized version she believed in, but the reality of what he had become, was unbearable. That weekend, instead of their planned college tour, James told Lily stories about defense attorneys who had inspired him, suggesting maybe she should consider both sides of the courtroom. His transparent attempt to redirect her ambitions only confused and hurt her. "I thought you were proud of what you do," she said. 3 years after Sullivan's conviction, James received notice that Martinez had filed a motion to review the case, citing newly discovered inconsistencies. She didn't know about the evidence James had hidden, but her persistent doubts had led her to re-interview witnesses, including Mr. Wilson, whose memory had improved with time and distance from trauma. The store owner now admitted he wasn't certain about his identification. James knew it was only a matter of time before more unraveled. That night, he drove to the storage facility where he had moved the envelope with the exculpatory photos after becoming too paranoid to keep them in his office. Standing there, staring at the sealed envelope he'd never had the courage to destroy, James finally admitted to himself what he had known all along. He had sacrificed an innocent man on the altar of his ambition. The realization didn't bring relief, only the certainty that whatever happened next, his life as he knew it was over. Judge Eleanor Ramsey had been a mentor to James since his early days as a prosecutor. Now in her 70s, she commanded respect throughout the legal community for her fairness and integrity. When James found himself assigned to her courtroom for a high-profile murder case, he was already on edge. Judge Ramsey had always seen through his polished exterior. After a particularly aggressive cross-examination, where James badgered a reluctant witness, Judge Ramsey called him to her chambers. "What's happened to you, James?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. "You used to pursue truth. Now you just seem desperate for victories." James started to defend himself, but the words stuck in his throat. "Whatever burden you're carrying," she continued, "it's changing how you practice law, and not for the better." Judge Ramsey's words haunted James, but it was a chance encounter with Sullivan's mother that truly shattered his defenses. He spotted her at the farmer's market, frail now, leaning on a cane as she inspected tomatoes. James nearly turned away, but something compelled him to approach her. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, heart pounding. "I'm James Calloway." Her eyes, so like her son's, studied him without surprise. "I know who you are, Mr. Prosecutor. I pray for you every night." The unexpected response knocked him off balance. "You pray for me?" She nodded slowly. "Matthew asks me to. He says you must be troubled to have done what you did." The simple statement, delivered without accusation, broke something open inside James. "How is he?" he asked, voice barely audible. "Surviving," she answered, "which is all any of us are doing." The conversation with Mrs. Sullivan left James raw and exposed. That night, he found himself driving to his father's house, the retired judge he had been trying to impress his entire life. Over glasses of scotch on the porch, James came closer than ever to confession. "Dad, did you ever wonder if you sent an innocent person to jail?" His father set down his glass, suddenly alert. "Every judge fears that, James. Why do you ask?" James couldn't bring himself to reveal the truth, but his father saw enough in his son's tortured expression to understand something was deeply wrong. "Whatever it is," the old judge said finally, "the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, it's what they do to fix them." On the drive home, James realized his father had given him both permission and directive, not to hide from his failure, but to confront it. The most unexpected mirror came through a young law student interning in James's office. Noah Chen was bright, idealistic, and reminiscent of James in his early career. During a case review meeting, Noah questioned the strength of evidence in a pending drug case. "But the defendant has prior convictions," another prosecutor argued. "Isn't that relevant?" Noah held his ground. "Not if the evidence in this case doesn't stand on its own." James watched this exchange with growing discomfort. seeing his younger self reflected in Noah's principled stance, and seeing what he had become in his colleagues' willingness to cut corners. After the meeting, Noah apologized for speaking out of turn. "Never apologize for standing up for due process," James told him, the words feeling both right and hypocritical in his mouth. Later, he overheard Noah telling another intern, "I want to be like Calloway someday." The comment, once gratifying, now felt like punishment. The final mirror appeared in the form of a news story about a man in another state, exonerated after 12 years in prison. James watched the coverage obsessively. The man's emergence from prison, blinking in the sunlight, the tearful reunion with family members, the press conference where he spoke not of bitterness, but of lost time. The prosecutor who had convicted him made a public apology, accepting responsibility for rushing to judgment. When asked if he could forgive this prosecutor, the exonerated man said simply, "I've had to forgive to survive. Holding on to anger would be another prison." That night, James dreamed he was standing before Matthew Sullivan, trying to apologize, but no sound came from his mouth. He woke understanding that the time for silence was over. The next morning, he did something he'd been avoiding for 3 years. He drove to the prison where Matthew Sullivan was serving his sentence and put his name on the visitor list. The prison visiting room was sterile and cold, buzzing with fluorescent lights. James sat at a metal table, heart hammering against his ribs as he waited. When Matthew Sullivan appeared in the doorway, James barely recognized him. 3 years of confinement had aged the man a decade, gray streaking his once dark hair, deep lines etched around his eyes. Sullivan stopped when he saw who his visitor was, confusion crossing his face. After a moment's hesitation, he sat across from James, his movements deliberate, controlled. Neither spoke immediately. James had rehearsed this moment countless times, but now words failed him. "My daughter thinks you want to offer me a deal," Sullivan finally said. "But that's not why you're here, is it?" James shook his head, swallowing hard. "No," he managed. "I'm here because I can't live with myself anymore." The confession poured out of James, how he'd hidden the evidence, coached the witness, known in his gut that Sullivan was innocent but proceeded anyway. With each admission, he expected rage, accusations, the anger Sullivan had every right to feel. Instead, Sullivan listened in silence, his expression impenetrable. When James finally fell quiet, Sullivan asked one question. Why now? Why after 3 years? It was the question James had been asking himself. "Because I thought I could outrun it," he answered honestly. "Because I thought what I did to you was survivable. For you and for me. I was wrong on both counts." Sullivan nodded slowly, studying James's face. "I've imagined this moment," he said finally. "Imagined what I'd say if you ever admitted what you did." He leaned forward. "But now that we're here, I just want to know one thing. What are you going to do about it?" The drive home from the prison was a blur. Sullivan's question echoed in James's mind. What are you going to do about it? Not what he felt, not how sorry he was, but what action he would take. The weight of responsibility settled on James's shoulders, heavier than the guilt had been. By the time he reached his driveway, a clarity he hadn't felt in years had taken hold. Sarah was in the kitchen when he entered. "I need to tell you something," he said without preamble. For the first time since the trial, he spoke the full truth aloud to another person. His wife listened, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to profound sadness. When he finished, she asked the same question Sullivan had. "What are you going to do now?" In that moment, James knew there was only one answer that mattered. "Whatever it takes to make it right," he said, "even if it costs me everything." That night, James sat his children down and told them the truth as well. Nathan's face hardened into disgust. Lily dissolved into tears. "How could you?" she kept asking. "You taught us about integrity. You taught us about justice." There was nothing James could say to defend himself. He didn't try. "I failed," he acknowledged. "I failed myself. I failed this family. And most of all, I failed an innocent man and his family. I can't undo that. But I can show you now what it means to take responsibility for your actions, no matter the consequences." Nathan stood abruptly and left the room, but Lily's tears slowly subsided. "Will you go to prison?" she asked finally. The question hung in the air between them. "I don't know," James answered truthfully. "But if that's what justice requires, then yes." The next morning, James entered his office before dawn. He removed the photos from his wall, the newspaper headlines, the awards, the commendations. and placed them in a box. Then he began writing a full confession detailing his misconduct in the Sullivan case, the evidence he had suppressed, the witness testimony he had influenced. When he finished, he made 3 copies. One he would submit to the State Bar Association, one he would give to the Attorney General's office, and one he would file with the court as a motion to vacate Sullivan's conviction. His hand trembled as he signed each document. By the time his staff began arriving, James had cleared his desk of personal items. His assistant Carol found him staring out the window. "Sir?" she asked tentatively. "Are you all right?" James turned to her, his expression both broken and resolved. "No," he answered. "But for the first time in years, I think I might be someday." James's confession sent shockwaves through the legal community. The morning after he filed the documents, his resignation as county prosecutor was announced. The media descended like vultures. Reporters camped outside his home, called his family members, dug through his past cases looking for other misconduct. The Attorney General appointed a special prosecutor to review the Sullivan case and investigate James's actions. Law enforcement officials who had worked with him expressed everything from betrayal to grudging respect for his honesty. Former colleagues distanced themselves, afraid his disgrace might be contagious. But amidst the public spectacle, James remained focused on one thing: getting Matthew Sullivan released from prison as quickly as possible. The legal process of overturning a conviction, even with a prosecutor's confession, proved frustratingly slow. James hired Martin Reynolds, the state's most respected defense attorney, paying the considerable fees from his own savings. Together, they filed emergency motions, petitioned judges, and pressured the system that James had once navigated so skillfully from the other side. Sarah supported him through it all, standing beside him during press conferences, where he publicly admitted his wrongdoing. "I don't condone what you did," she told him privately, "but I admire what you're doing now." Nathan remained distant, but Lily began accompanying them to court hearings, witnessing firsthand both the cost and value of her father's belated integrity. 3 months after James's confession, a judge finally ordered Matthew Sullivan's release pending a formal exoneration. James wanted to be there when Sullivan walked free, but Reynolds advised against it. "This moment belongs to him and his family," the attorney counseled. "Your presence would make it about you." Recognizing the wisdom in this, James instead watched the news coverage from home, Sullivan embracing his mother and daughter on the courthouse steps, thin but standing tall. When a reporter asked Sullivan about the prosecutor who had both imprisoned and then freed him, Sullivan's response was measured. "I believe in second chances. I've been given one, and maybe Mr. Calloway deserves one too, but that's not for me to decide." The grace in those words humbled James in a way that no punishment could have. The legal consequences came swiftly. James's law license was suspended pending disbarment proceedings. The special prosecutor filed criminal charges for evidence tampering, witness manipulation, and obstruction of justice, charges that carried potential prison time. Most of James's assets went to legal fees and to a settlement fund he established for Sullivan. He sold their family home and moved with Sarah into a modest apartment. Former friends crossed the street to avoid him. Parents at Lily's school whispered when he attended her events. Through it all, James accepted the consequences without complaint or self-pity. "This is the price of redemption," he told Sarah one night after a particularly difficult court appearance, "and it's still less than what Sullivan paid." In an unexpected development, Matthew Sullivan himself reached out to James, requesting a meeting away from cameras and reporters. They met at a small diner on the outskirts of town. The conversation was awkward at first, but gradually something remarkable happened. They began to talk like two men who shared a profound, if difficult, connection. "I've been thinking about forgiveness," Sullivan said. "Not forgiving you would be like drinking poison and expecting you to die." Or when James asked what he could do beyond what he was already doing, Sullivan considered the question carefully. "Use your story," he finally said. "There are other innocent people in prison right now, other prosecutors cutting corners. Maybe hearing from you would make a difference." On the way home, James began mentally drafting a book that would expose the flaws in the system he had once exploited, and propose reforms to prevent others from suffering Sullivan's fate. 1 year after James's confession, he stood before a judge for his own sentencing. The courtroom was packed: journalists, legal observers, and to James's surprise, Matthew Sullivan and his family. James had pleaded guilty to all charges, declining the plea deal that would have given him probation in exchange for testimony against others in the prosecutor's office. His attorney had argued for leniency based on his cooperation and voluntary confession. Now, as the judge prepared to announce his sentence, James made a final statement to the court. "I don't stand before you seeking mercy," he said, voice steady. "What I did was unforgivable. A man lost 3 years of his life because I valued winning above justice. Whatever sentence you impose, I accept it." The judge sentenced James to 2 years in prison, less than the maximum possible, but a clear message that his position of trust had made his crime more serious. As he was led away in handcuffs, James caught Sullivan's eye. The man nodded once, a gesture not of satisfaction, but of acknowledgement. Later, Sarah would tell him that Sullivan had approached her outside the courthouse. "I take no pleasure in seeing your husband go to prison," he'd told her, "but I take comfort in knowing that the system eventually worked, even for someone as powerful as him." That night, in a holding cell awaiting transfer to the state penitentiary, James felt something he hadn't expected. Not happiness, certainly, but a kind of peace. The path ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, he was walking in the light of truth. James's experience in prison was transformative in ways he hadn't anticipated. He used his legal knowledge to help fellow inmates with their cases, discovering numerous instances of questionable evidence and rushed convictions. With Sullivan's encouragement, he began documenting these cases, laying groundwork for appeals. The prison chaplain, noticing James's commitment to making amends, invited him to speak to groups about accountability and redemption. Initially reluctant, James found unexpected healing in sharing his story. "Your greatest mistake doesn't have to be your legacy," he would tell the inmates. "What you do after the mistake, that's what defines you." Some mocked his message, but others found hope in it. One young man told James, "I thought screwing up meant game over. Maybe it's just a different game now." Outside the prison walls, the ripple effects of James's actions continued to spread. His case became required reading in legal ethics courses. The state Supreme Court instituted new disclosure requirements for prosecutors. Emily Sullivan, now finishing college, began speaking at law schools about the human cost of wrongful convictions. Matthew Sullivan used his settlement money to start a small construction company, making a point of hiring former inmates who needed second chances. Most surprisingly, Nathan, who had barely spoken to his father since the confession, enrolled in law school. "I want to be part of fixing the system," he told Lily during a prison visit that James didn't know about. "Not like Dad did it, but because of what Dad did." 18 months into his sentence, James received news that he was being considered for early release. The parole board cited his exemplary behavior, his work helping other inmates, and, most significantly, a letter from Matthew Sullivan supporting his release. When James expressed surprise at this development, his cellmate shrugged. "Maybe the man figured you both did your time." The prospect of freedom brought both hope and anxiety. James had adjusted to the rhythms of prison life, to the clarity of purpose he'd found there. The outside world, with its complications and temptations, seemed suddenly daunting. The night before his parole hearing, he wrote in the journal he'd been keeping, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I know this much. The man who walked into prison isn't the man who will walk out. I lost everything I thought mattered, only to find what actually does. The question now is what to do with this second chance I never gave Matthew Sullivan." James Calloway served 20 months of his 2-year sentence before being released on parole. He emerged from prison to find a world that had largely moved on from his scandal, though his name would forever be associated with both wrongdoing and redemption. Matthew Sullivan's construction company had grown, providing jobs to dozens of former inmates. They occasionally met for coffee, not as friends exactly, but as two men forever linked by circumstance and choice. James never returned to practicing law. Instead, he channeled his legal knowledge into advocacy work, pushing for reforms in prosecutorial accountability and evidence handling. The book he wrote about his experience became required reading in law schools nationwide. When Lily graduated from law school 5 years after her father's release, James sat in the audience with tears in his eyes, watching her take an oath to uphold the principles he had once betrayed. The moral of this story isn't simply that honesty matters or that justice prevails. It's that redemption is possible, but never free. It demands a price commensurate with the harm done. James Calloway couldn't return 3 years to Matthew Sullivan, couldn't erase the pain he caused. But in facing his failure with courage, in accepting consequences without excuse, he transformed a story of injustice into one of belated accountability. The system worked, however imperfectly and belatedly, because one man finally chose truth over self-preservation. And for Matthew Sullivan, justice delayed was better than justice forever denied. What began as a tragedy, an innocent man imprisoned, became something more complex, a testament to the human capacity for both terrible mistakes and remarkable growth. The question for all of us isn't whether we will fail. We will, in ways large and small, but what we do in the aftermath. Do we hide from our failures, bury them under justifications and excuses, or do we face them squarely, accept their consequences, and use them to become better? James Calloway's journey reminds us that it's never too late to choose the harder, truer path. His story isn't one of perfect redemption. Such things don't exist. Rather, it's about the messy, painful, necessary work of making amends, of understanding that sometimes, "I'm sorry," isn't enough. Sometimes, true apology requires action, sacrifice, and the courage to face yourself in the mirror, no matter how much you fear what you might see. Remember this story the next time you're tempted to cut corners, to prioritize winning over truth, or to justify small compromises in the name of ambition. Remember Matthew Sullivan, whose life was nearly destroyed by another man's moral failure. And remember James Calloway, who discovered too late that success built on deception is no success at all, that the weight of false witness eventually crushes those who bear it. As you go forward in your own life, making your own choices, ask yourself not just, "Can I get away with this?" but "Can I live with myself if I do?" Because in the end, the judgment that matters most isn't found in any courtroom. It's the one we face every morning in the mirror,